Hi, I'm Emily Taylor from Collage Quilter. Today I'm going to teach you how to do a binding on a quilt from start to finish. Now it doesn't matter if it's a collage quilt or a traditional quilt, it's going to be the same. I am demonstrating on a collage quilt. This quilt is called the Clementine Collage Quilt. It's actually a beginner pattern, and if you're interested in this quilt you can find it over at collagequilter.com. So I've had this quilt for a while and I never bound it because I like the look of the raw edge. We're dealing with lots of raw edges with collage quilts. But today, to show you how to do a binding, I thought I would go ahead and bind this quilt. So what I've got right here, you can kind of see the fabric that I've selected is right here underneath it. It's a very low volume print. It does provide just a subtle contrast between the main quilt and the binding. And for this quilt, that's what I wanted because the background has this low volume collage going from edge to edge. And so I didn't want anything that was going to be a really hard stop. I wanted it to just be soft. So we mess around with I pull in lots of different types of fabric and just audition fabrics when I'm selecting a binding, because if I've put so much energy and effort into making a beautiful quilt, I want to make sure that the binding is just perfect. So I feel like this is it, and I kind of always know it when I see it. If there's any question, then I'm like, nope, I'll keep looking. So sometimes I'll go through a half dozen different types of different fabrics to see what really fits. And this one really fits. And again, I'm going to explain the reason why. It's low volume, but it does provide enough contrast from the background, but it's very soft and subtle. It's got a very organic print. It's a dense print, so that it really works well with the quilt. So right here I've got a couple options that were no's that we considered. Let me pull this one over here first. So this one, you can see I've actually used this fabric in the collage itself. And so I thought that might be fun to pull out to the border. But the best way to audition is to just lay your quilt down and kind of tuck this under the edge so that you can see what it's going to look like. Now, yeah, it matches, but I don't like it because it's a high contrast print and it's very busy and it's just a little bit overpowering for the quilt. So I'm going to set that aside. We're not going to use that. One of the other pieces that I looked at was this green, and while I've got a lot of green in the quilt, when I put it up like this against it, I thought, you know what, again, it's too high contrast. I want to keep this kind of subtle so that the emphasis is on the main subject of the quilt. So I've eliminated that one as well. And then we started going to more neutral fabric, quieter fabric, and this was one that we pulled over. Now this one, I think it works really well, but let me tell you why I decided this is not a good choice for my binding. It has a very subtle stripe. So this is kind of like a basket weave print, and that subtle vertical stripe is a big no-no on bindings. And the reason is because it's very difficult to match that stripe perfectly along with the edge of your quilt. When you don't do that, it becomes really obvious that it just looks a little bit skewed. So I try to stay away from anything that has the suggestion of a stripe, unless the stripe goes this way. So I love to use a binding where the stripe is small stripes, but never the long stripes against the edge of the quilt. So anyway, that's a little tip about selecting fabric. So this is the fabric that I've selected. Now my chore is to figure out how much of this fabric I need to cut. So I'm going to walk you through that. I like to have about a 1/2 inch binding. So if I'm going to do a 1/2 inch, I need to cut, it needs to be 3.5 inch strips. So let me repeat that. For a 1/2 inch binding, and I do a double fold binding, I need my strips are going to be 3.5 inches wide. So now I'm going to write that down, okay? Keep your pencil and paper there. I'm going to do 3.5 inch wide strips, and now I have to calculate how many strips I'm going to need. So the way I do this is I'm going to measure from across the quilt, and I actually do this on two. I do it at the top and the bottom just to confirm that the quilt is square. So we've got just a little over 23 inches here and the same right there. So I'm just going to round up and say it's 24 inches wide, okay? So write that down, 24 inches wide, and then I'll measure the length. So this quilt it's about 37 inches tall or long. So let me just double check that. I always double check my measurements, but that's pretty darn close. Yep, okay, so 37 inches is the height of this quilt. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is just take my trusty calculator that's on my phone, and I'm going to, so 24 inches wide is 48 inches. Now I need to double it, obviously, because I need the perimeter. So I've got this end here is 24, and this end here is 24, so that's 48 inches, and then 37 plus 37 is 74 inches. Okay, so the perimeter of this quilt then, I'm going to add together 74 inches and 48 inches. Gives me 122 inches is the perimeter of the quilt. Now there's a method that I use, and I like to add about 20 inches to that. So I've got 122 around, and just to have some wiggle room when I am doing my continuous binding, which I'll show you in just a minute, I like to add 20 inches. So if I add 20 inches to that, that gives me 142 inches. So I need 142 inches of continuous binding strip to bind this quilt. So the way I figure that out now is we know the width of the fabric is roughly 42 to 44 inches, okay? So when I say the width of fabric, what I mean is from selvage to selvage. So here is the selvage to selvage. Now if I open this up like that, that's roughly 42 to 44 inches from most manufacturers. That's the standard width of the fabric. So I'm just going to say it's 44 inches wide, and what I'm going to do is take that number 142 on my calculator and divide that by 40. We'll divide it by 42 inches. So that gives me 3.38. Okay, well, I don't want to worry about cutting a half a strip, so I'm just going to round that number up. So I got 3.38, so that's 4 strips. 4 strips that are 3.5 inches wide. Let me just say, if I were to assume that the width of fabric is 44 inches, let's see if that makes any difference. So 142 divided by 44 gives me 3.2. Well, I still have to round up. So I know that I'm very safe in saying I need 4 strips of fabric that are cut 3.5 inches wide. So that's going to be the next step. So I'm going to iron my fabric, and I'm going to get it ready to cut. So I'll see you in just a second. All right, I've pressed my fabric. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, if you are going to a fabric company or a retailer fabric shop to buy your fabric, what you'll tell them is, so what I'm going to do is figure out, as I said, we need 4 strips that are 3.5 inches wide. So if I multiply those together, that gives me 14 inches. So when I go to the counter, I can say I just need 14 inches of fabric. And if you want to be a little bit careful, give yourself an extra inch or something. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that I cut my fabric now at 3.5 inches. So I'm using my rotary cutter and my mat. Oh, you know what? I've got this great ruler and I stuck this sticky thing on here so it holds it in place. It kind of grips the fabric and I really like that. So here we go. Here's our first strip. And the second strip. I like to be very, very precise when I'm cutting my fabric. Third strip. And my final strip at 14 inches. Okay, there we go. Now I have my strips of fabric, but I need to turn this into a continuous strip, right? So now what I'm going to do is I will take these over to my sewing machine. Oops, I can see a few pieces that didn't get cut. There's a few strands. Let's just separate those. Okay, there. So we have all 4 strips. Now I need to make sure that I need to sew these together, right? When we're doing a binding, we want to make sure that the seam to join these strips together is on an angle so that when you go to fold it over, you don't have one seam that is bunched up in the same area. So you're kind of spreading the seam out. So the way we're going to do this is simply take our strips and make sure that you do it right side together. So many times I have sewn it the wrong way. So I'm going to lay it across like this, and you can take some pins if you'd like and pin them together. But when I take this over to the machine, this is how it's going to be. And I like to confirm always that I'm going to be cutting right here. You know what? I should grab a little, let me get a little marker and some pins so that I can show you exactly kind of how I do it without making any errors. I'll be right back. Here I am again. Okay, so I just grabbed some pins and I've got a fabric marker, an erasable fabric marker, and I think this will just be helpful for you to see. I like to take a pin and I'm going to pin it pretty close to, I pin it in the angle that I'm sewing. So my stitch line will go from corner to corner like this. I'm going to draw this on here so that we can see it really well when we get to the machine, okay? So there we go. That's what it's going to look like. That's my stitch line from the corner to the other edge of the fabric where they meet. And I can confirm that this is the correct way to put these together when I fold this up and then I see, oh yeah, that's the right way. So I always test it to make sure I've got that the right way. And I'm just going to do that with each of these. So I'm going to turn this over so that it's right sides together and take another strip, same thing. And you can see too that I'm overlapping them, leaving about a 1/2 inch that will be cut off. So again, just for the sake of a good visual, I'll draw kind of my stitch line here, and then I'm going to have one more seam to worry about as I join these last couple together. Open it up, right sides together. I'm leaving a little bit of an overlap, about a 1/2 inch on both pieces. What I mean is this 1/2 inch and that 1/2 inch. So that roughly covers the selvage. So I won't see the selvage in my finished binding at all. Okay, and again, I can double check and just make sure, okay, yes, that's the right direction, and we are ready to go sew. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. We're going to put this together real quick. Okay, here I am ready to join these strips together to create one continuous binding strip. So you can see how helpful that line is along there. Wow, that is incredibly helpful. So I'll go ahead and do these other two You don't need to watch unless you want to. No, you don't need to watch, but this is what I want to show you. So this right here will be a perfect seam to create the continuous strip. So I will stitch these together along that seam, and then I will cut this, trim it, and trim those dog ears. And I will see you over at the ironing board. All right, so I've got my ironing board here, and while my iron heats up, I'm just going to trim along that edge. All right, and then we will have ourselves one complete binding strip. So I cut off those triangles, and then I also cut off these little dog ears here. And this is how to do a fun binding. I love it. I am using a 1/2 inch here. You can do a 1/4 inch cut, but I'm just doing a 1/2 inch because it makes it easier to open up. Because I'm going to press the seam open. A 1/4 inch seam is a little bit tricky, a little bit hard to open, especially when you have a hot, steamy iron. Ooh, I tend to burn my fingers. All right, so now it looks like this, nice and tidy. And then when I open it up, ta-da, there's my continuous strip. So now I'm going to open up those 3 seams, and then we will fold this over to create the double folded strip. And you might be wondering, is this a straight binding or bias binding? This is a straight binding because you remember we cut it on the straight of grain from selvage to selvage. There's a little bit of a different method to fold and cut the fabric if you're going to do a bias binding. And the only reason that you would need a bias binding is if you had some rounded edges on your quilt, the bias will allow the binding to be kind of stretchy, and so it goes around some corners really well. Okay, so now I've got those seams pressed open, and now I'm going to take the end of this and I'm going to fold it in half. So wrong side together like this, and just start pressing this whole thing. So I will press this entire strip of binding fabric together, and again I just kind of am super careful as I go to make sure, and I'm going to add a little bit of steam now. I'm going to make sure that those raw edges are folded and line up perfectly. And I will take care of this. You don't need to watch me while I iron the whole thing. If you really get a kick out of watching me iron, you can rewind the video and watch it again and again. But otherwise, I'll take a little break and show you how we're going to apply this to the quilt. So I will see you in just a minute. All right, so I have my double folded binding that will make a perfect 1/2 inch continuous binding strip around this quilt. But remember how I said I added an additional 20 inches? So I'm going to start my stitching I'm going to leave a 10-inch tail. So I'm going to mark that. I'm going to line up the raw edges of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt, and I'm going to stick a pin at about, it can be rough, but about 10 inches so that I know where to begin my stitching. So there I go, right there. And I can pin it to the quilt just until I get to the corner. And then when I get to the corner, I'm going to actually take this off the machine and turn it so that I can get a perfectly mitered corner. But just to make sure that the fabric stays where it's supposed to, I'm going to go ahead and put some pins in so that it's ready to take over to my machine and get started with applying the binding to the quilt. So there we go. I've got a few pins. The raw edges are lined up, and this is my continuous binding strip. So I'll see you over at the sewing machine. All right, one thing I want to show you, remember how I said this is going to be, my seam line will be a 1/2 inch from the edge of the binding. So to confirm, make sure that I know where my needle is and where that 1/2 inch mark is. I like to take this little handy ruler and just double check that I know exactly the notch on my stitch plate that I need to follow along to get that 1/2 inch. So here we go, I got it right there. And here's the pin to indicate the beginning of my stitching. And I'm just going to apply my binding right here, easy peasy. Now, the thing with binding is I highly recommend either a dual feed, like I have on this Bernina 720. The dual feed is right here in the back, and it ensures that the fabric on the top moves the same as the fabric that's being grabbed by the feed dogs on the bottom of the machine. If you don't have a dual foot capability with your machine, go ahead and maybe invest in, I would highly recommend investing in a walking foot that can be used on your machine. A walking foot does the same thing. So when we're dealing with quilts and it's a thicker fabric because we've got the batting and everything in there, we want everything to be very equal when we're moving the fabric through the machine. Okay, so I'm going to stop. Here's another reason for having this tool handy. I want to stop a 1/2 inch from my from the edge of the fabric. So I'm just gonna, I should have marked this beforehand, and we'll mark it next time so that we can ensure that we know exactly. So I think if I do one more stitch there. Now I'm gonna back stitch just a little bit to secure that and pull it out. And now I'm going to turn the corner so that I can make sure I have a perfectly mitered corner. So I actually take my quilt and I twist it, and I'm going to cut these threads because they're bugging me. All right, so here's my binding. It's been applied on that side, but I need to turn the corner and make sure that I have a perfectly mitered corner. So I like to actually wrap my binding around my neck so that it stays off the floor. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this out so that the binding is, so I have a perfect 45-degree angle right here up to the corner, and I want to ensure that this is one continuous line. Okay, so just make sure that that's in a continuous line, and then I'm going to kind of finger press it, and I will fold it down on top of each other. I like to have about 1/8 of an inch overlap up here. So I like to have 1/8 of an inch right here from the edge of the quilt that overlaps, so that fold is just over 1/8 of an inch. That helps me get a really, really crisp corner. And now I'm going to just fold this down, and again make sure that the binding fabric matches the edge of the quilt. So right there. Now I'm going to pin it. Just pin this all in place because I don't want that to move. There we go. So it looks like that when I'm going to put it back in my machine. And I can even add a few more. I can add a few more pins to ensure that that's really steady. Okay, so you'll see there's kind of the little, that's the little corner that's going to flip over and be a perfect mitered, tight, straight corner. So now the other thing too that I need to be aware of is I don't want to catch that fabric on the back. So I can kind of feel where the fabric is folded over, and if I take my fingernail, I can kind of, that provides kind of a nice guide, or I can just go like this, and that helps me to see where the fabric is folded over. And then I'm going to feed this back under the foot at the 1/2 inch mark, and I can just line it up about right there, so that my stitching begins right on that line, or a little bit past the line. Now I just continue until I get to the next corner. So I will just continue putting this binding on like this. And we can go over that corner one more time with the next one, just to ensure that you've got it right. Or not. We'll see what Amelia, the videographer, is willing to do for us. You can kind of see how this is bunching up just a little bit. So I kind of adjust it and straighten it out a little bit as I'm going. Now here we are at the other end, and I just want to take this one more time and say, okay, I'm going to stop a 1/2 inch from the edge, and just mark that. So there we go. That's where I know I'm going to stop my stitching. Okay. All right. Now again, we're going to turn the quilt around, and we're going to fold it up like this, and then back on itself. I'm going to make sure that edge is straight. Finger press that, fold it down again, leave a little bit of wiggle room up there, about 1/8 of an inch, so that we have a nice nice corner. And I'm gonna go like this, just put a pin in there just to hold everything. I'm gonna press that and kind of feel where the edge of the fabric is, and I might want to go like that too, so that I know where to stitch and where not to stitch. Put it at the at the 1/2 inch mark. Adjust it just a little bit, and there we go. Now I'm back in business. Okay, so you've seen 2 corners now, and I'm going to go ahead and continue this, and then we'll flip this over and go to the next step. So I'll see you in a minute. All right, so I have my binding all around the quilt. I've left the 2 ends off that are going to meet. So what I'm going to do is fold them into each other like this. I'm going to press them or finger press them, just so that I get a little mark, so that I know where the center is of this fabric. And then I'm going to fold it back, and you can see I've already marked it with my fabric marker. That's the center, so that's what I'm looking for. So just remember that I need an 1/8 of an inch in between these, and then I'm ready to stitch them together. So the way I do that is I'm going to fold this side out nice and flat like this, okay? And then this side, I'm going to turn it so that it turns in this way, and I'm going to lay that right on top. And I've marked the wrong side of the fabric here, so that I know it goes right on top of that mark there. Now I'm going to, if I fold that over, that will kind of stay in place a little bit better. Now I'm going to mark where my stitch line is, and I always test this by making sure I've got the right angle and that this is the right measurement. I'm going to just pin these pieces of fabric together, and when I fold it back out, you'll see that it's going to be a perfectly continuous seam. So now what I'm going to do, just to help me over at the machine, I am going to just indicate where that stitch line should go. So I'll take, it should go right there. All right, now I'm going to take this back over to my machine and stitch that, and then I will trim these off and we'll do the continuous binding, and I'll show you how to do that over at the machine. All right, so now you can see how helpful that stitch line is. So I'm going to put my foot down and just follow that stitch line. Let's pull my pins out. I'm going to go right through that center that I've indicated. And now let's double check that that is the right, yep, that looks perfect. So now I'm just going to do this at my machine. Actually, I've got some sharp scissors here. Let's fold this over again. And I'm going to trim off these edges. Okay, take my scissors. Trim off those dog ears. Get rid of that, that's done. And now I want to press that seam open. So I'm going to press that seam open real quick, and then, actually I think I can just finger press that. And then I'm going to fold this over again. Let's just make sure that that finger pressing stays open. There. I think we got it. Okay, nice and tidy. And now I can just continue the stitch line. So I'm going to go back up where I finished the seam line right here. Line it up where I began, and now I can finish the stitching here. And again, just making sure that my raw edges are lined up and that I'm stitching on the 1/2 inch hash. Okay, easy peasy. Now we'll take this over to my iron and press it to the other side and finish this baby up. All right, so here we have the binding 100% on the quilt. You can see it's just lined up with the edge. All I've done is gone with an iron, a really hot iron, and pressed it back. So I want to show you how beautiful these little corners look. So I've pressed that, and now it's ready to flip over, and I will just fold it on top of each other like this, and ta-da, look at that beautiful mitered corner, right? So now with that laying down, this is where I'm going to start my stitching. So let's zoom in just a little bit so that we can see the actual stitching. All right, so this is where I'm going to start my stitching. I've got my needle and thread here, and then a couple other things I wanted to show you. I have this, whenever I'm doing my hand binding, I keep this little pouch. It's got my needles in it and some pins. It's got needles in it and pins, and then it's got the binding clips, and these are super helpful to just be able to ensure that the binding is laying down. So I can put one right there. And now what I'm going to do is just make sure, so I've already pulled the thread up. I'm going to tuck the end of the thread there if I can. And the other thing that I have in here that I really like is my little handy dandy leather thimble. And hand binding is my very favorite thing to do. It's actually just so soothing. So I'm just going to go down straight and then go through the fabric, making sure that I'm not catching it on the front. If I can see my needle on the front, then I'm going to pull that out and just ensure that I'm only catching the backing of the fabric and not the front of the fabric. So there we go. Now I will finish this up, and that is my perfectly bound quilt. So I hope this has been a super helpful tutorial about putting on a continuous binding onto your quilt. Thanks for joining me. If you have any questions about tutorials or patterns or books by Emily Taylor, go to collagequilter.com.